In the spring of 1938, Kyiv was a city suspended between epochs. The chestnut trees along Kreshtik Street bloomed as they always had, indifferent to the terror unfolding in the limestone buildings that lined the boulevard. The Great Purge had entered its most lethal phase. Every evening, black sedans departed the NKVD headquarters on what is now Volodymyrska Street, carrying men and women who would never return. Yet according to certain researchers of Soviet history, something else was happening in those buildings, something that would seem absurd if it weren't so perfectly characteristic of the era's technological ambitions and paranoid logic. The story begins with fragments. A former archivist in Moscow claims to have seen a file labeled Project Glass Sparrow during the brief chaos of 1991, when Soviet repositories were momentarily vulnerable to scrutiny. The file vanished before it could be copied. A retired KGB officer mentioned the project in passing during a 2003 interview, then refused to elaborate. And there is a photograph, or rather, there are people who insist they've seen a photograph of a small optical device next to a bird's skull, taken from an angle that reveals nothing conclusive. These breadcrumbs have been enough to sustain a persistent rumor in certain circles of Cold War historians and conspiracy enthusiasts. According to this narrative, the NKVD's Kyiv Directorate initiated Operation Glass Sparrow in late 1937. The concept was simultaneously visionary and deranged, to create a living surveillance platform by surgically implanting miniature optical recording devices into the skulls of birds. Not just any birds, mind you, but corvids, crows, magpies, jackdaws, species known for their intelligence and their habit of lingering near human activity. The birds would become, in effect, flying cameras, capable of accessing spaces no human agent could penetrate. They could perch on window sills, roost in attics, and observe conversations in parks without arousing the slightest suspicion. In an age before satellites or drones, the idea possessed a certain terrible elegance. The technical challenges would have been extraordinary. This was 1938. Transistors did not exist. The smallest cameras required cumbersome film mechanisms to create an optical device capable of fitting inside a bird's skull. Even a large corvid would have demanded miniaturization techniques far beyond the era's conventional engineering. Yet the Soviet Union had demonstrated remarkable innovation in specialized fields when resources were concentrated. The Moscow Institute of Optics had produced some of the world's finest lenses. Soviet biologists, before Lysenkoism destroyed their profession, had conducted pioneering research in animal neurology. If any nation in 1938 possessed the combination of optical expertise, biological knowledge, and institutional paranoia necessary to attempt such a project, it was Stalin's USSR. The operation allegedly centered on a laboratory in Kyiv's Persist district, not far from the ancient monastery. A biologist, unnamed in all accounts, which is historically characteristic of Purge-era victims, supposedly led the research team. This individual had training in both ornithology and surgical techniques, a rare combination. The laboratory itself, according to the fragments of testimony that exist, occupied rooms in a building that served multiple NKVD functions. One floor might house interrogation cells, another floor, experimental science. This architectural intermingling of violence and research was typical of the period. The same institution could torture a suspected Trotskyite in the basement while attempting to revolutionize surveillance technology upstairs. The optical micromodule itself represents the conspiracy's most technically dubious element. Descriptions vary, but most accounts suggest a device no larger than a grain of rice, capable of capturing visual information and storing it on some form of photosensitive medium. The mechanism for retrieval remains unexplained. Would the bird need to be recaptured? Would the data somehow transmit? These questions remain unanswered, which is either evidence of the story's fabrication or simply the incompleteness of the historical record. Classified Soviet projects often proceeded with remarkable compartmentalization. Scientists working on one component might never understand the full system. The selection and training of the birds presented its own complications. Corvids are intelligent, but intelligence does not equal obedience. A crow cannot be commanded like a dog. The NKVD's theoretical approach, as described in the apocryphal accounts, involved conditioning birds to associate specific locations with food rewards. Once a bird was successfully implanted with the optical module, assuming this was even possible, it would be released near a target location where it had previously found food. The bird would return to that location naturally, observe whatever occurred there, and then theoretically return to the laboratory, where the recorded information could be extracted. The entire scheme depended on avian behavior patterns remaining consistent, which any ornithologist would recognize as an unreliable foundation for espionage. The phrase that has become central to the legend appears in what some researchers claim is a fragment of the project's final report. The bird sees everything, but understands nothing. It's a perfect encapsulation of the operation's fundamental flaw. A camera records indiscriminately. It cannot distinguish between significant conversations and meaningless small talk, between innocent gatherings and conspiratorial meetings. Human intelligence, even human observation, involves interpretation, context, judgment. A bird equipped with a recording device would produce data without meaning, surveillance without analysis. The phrase itself has a literary quality that makes some historians suspicious. It's almost too perfect, too philosophical for a bureaucratic report. Yet Soviet documents often contain surprising eloquence, especially when their authors were trying to explain failure. The operation's collapse, according to the legend, occurred in early 1938. At Scoutchik, the term used in the alleged documentation, was being tested near the government house, an imposing constructivist building on Hrushevsky Street that housed Soviet administrative offices. This building, completed in 1936, represented the new socialist architecture, functional, monumental, severe. Its large windows were a distinctive feature, allowing light to flood the administrative corridors. On the morning in question, the test sparrow, or jackdaw, or crow, depending on which version one reads, was released to observe activity near the building's entrance. The bird flew directly into one of those large windows. The impact killed it instantly, scattering fragments of whatever optical device had been implanted across the pavement. The incident, if it occurred, could not have been more publicly embarrassing. Government House was among the most visible buildings in Kyiv, constantly monitored by security personnel. The crashed bird, with its unnatural cranial modifications, would have been immediately recovered and examined. Questions would have followed. Reports would have been filed. In the paranoid atmosphere of 1938, such a spectacular failure would have demanded accountability. Someone would need to be blamed. Someone always needed to be blamed. The biologist leading the research vanished from the historical record shortly after the alleged incident. Transferred to Siberia due to family circumstances, a standard euphemism for punitive relocation during the purges. What happened to this nameless biologist remains unknown. Did they survive their Siberian exile? Did they continue research in some remote laboratory? Did they perish in the camps? One more casualty of the Great Terror? The silence is absolute, which again is either evidence of fabrication or simply the typical fate of mid-level Soviet scientists who fell from favor. Thousands of researchers were arrested during this period. Thousands more were transferred, demoted, or simply erased from institutional memory. The absence of records proves nothing. The Soviet system specialized in making people disappear, both physically and bureaucratically. The broader historical context makes Operation Glass Sparrow seem simultaneously plausible and absurd. This was the era of Lysenkoism, when ideologically correct pseudoscience received state support while genuine genetics was suppressed. This was the era when the NKVD was conducting grotesque medical experiments in pursuit of truth serums and interrogation techniques. This was the era when Soviet intelligence services were pioneering new surveillance methods, developing hidden microphones and early eavesdropping technologies. The regime's combination of scientific ambition, institutional paranoia, and complete disregard for ethical constraints created an environment where almost any experimental program becomes believable. If the NKVD could test poison gas on human subjects, why not optical implants in birds? Yet the conspiracy also exhibits classic markers of apocryphal narratives. The conveniently missing documentation. The anonymous sources. The perfectly ironic conclusion, the bird crashing into the very building it was meant to surveil. The poetic phrase that seems too eloquent for a bureaucratic report. These elements suggest a story constructed retroactively, a Cold War legend that emerged decades after the events it purports to describe. Some researchers have suggested that Operation Glass Sparrow is actually a composite tale, blending genuine Soviet surveillance programs with fictional embellishments, gradually accreting details through repeated retellings until it achieved its current narrative coherence. There are, however, fragments of corroborating context. The Soviet Union did conduct extensive research on animal-based intelligence gathering during this period. Trained dogs were used to detect explosives. Pigeons were studied for their navigational abilities. The NKVD's predecessor organization, the Cheka, had experimented with various unconventional surveillance methods in the 1920s. None of this proves that Operation Glass Sparrow existed, but it demonstrates that such a project would not have been entirely outside the regime's operational philosophy. The Soviets were willing to explore technological possibilities that other intelligence services might have dismissed as impractical. The optical technology required for the alleged micromodule presents the strongest argument against the conspiracy's plausibility. In 1938, the smallest functional cameras were still considerably larger than anything that could be implanted in a bird skull. Photographic film required chemical processing. There was no digital storage. Any recording device would need not just lenses but a shutter mechanism, a light-sensitive medium, and a way to advance that medium between exposures. The engineering would have been essentially impossible with 1930s technology. Yet impossible is not the same as impossible. Military necessity has often driven technological innovation beyond contemporary expectations. The Nazis would develop guided missiles within a decade. The Americans would build atomic weapons. Perhaps miniaturized optical devices were not as far-fetched as they now seem. The biological feasibility is equally questionable. Bird skulls are delicate structures, evolved for minimum weight to facilitate flight. The avian brain is compact and highly specialized. Implanting any foreign object would likely cause tissue damage, infection, or behavioral changes that would compromise the bird's survival. A bird that cannot fly properly becomes useless for surveillance. A bird that behaves abnormally attracts attention, defeating the purpose of covert observation. The surgical techniques required to successfully implant a device while preserving normal function would be extraordinarily sophisticated. Whether such techniques existed in 1938 is doubtful, though again, the Soviet medical establishment had access to resources and subjects that permitted experimentation most other nations would have considered unethical. What are we to make of Government House itself? The building still stands on Hrushevsky Street, now occupied by various Ukrainian government offices. Its constructivist architecture, the clean lines, the functional design, the large windows, remain striking. Those windows are real. Birds do occasionally crash into them, as birds crash into windows everywhere. If one were constructing a conspiracy theory, Government House would be an excellent choice for the climactic incident. It was symbolically important in 1938. It was architecturally distinctive. It had those characteristic large windows. The specificity of the location lends the story verisimilitude, which is precisely why false narratives often anchor themselves to real places. The timing of the alleged operation is historically significant. Early 1938 was the absolute peak of the Great Terror. In Ukraine specifically, this period saw the most intense phase of purges. The NKVD was operating with virtually unlimited authority. Thousands were being arrested weekly. Show trials were staged to legitimize the carnage. In this atmosphere of complete institutional chaos and ideological fervor, would the NKVD have had the organizational capacity to conduct sophisticated technical experiments? The question cuts both ways. Either the chaos would have made experimental programs impossible, or it would have created an environment where nothing seemed too extreme, where any proposal advancing state security might receive approval. The biologist's fate, transferred to Siberia due to family circumstances, is a detail that rings absolutely true. This was the standard bureaucratic language used to mask punitive relocations during the purges. Actual family circumstances would have been stated explicitly. The euphemism signaled that something had gone wrong, that someone was being removed from their position for political or operational reasons. Tens of thousands of Soviet citizens received similar notifications. They would be given days to pack. Their colleagues would be instructed not to discuss the matter. They would vanish into the administrative vastness of the Soviet interior. Some survived. Most did not. The detail is historically accurate, which again proves nothing. A skillfully constructed false narrative would include accurate details. So where does this leave us? With a story that is certainly possible, probably embellished, and ultimately unverifiable. Operation Glass Sparrow exhibits the classic characteristics of a conspiracy theory, a kernel of historical plausibility surrounded by layers of speculation, anecdote, and narrative elaboration. The Soviet Union did conduct unusual intelligence experiments. Kyiv in 1938 was a center of NKVD activity. Government House exists, with its large windows, but the optical technology seems too advanced. The biological feasibility seems too questionable. The documentary evidence is too conveniently absent. The story is too perfectly ironic. These factors suggest that Glass Sparrow is more folklore than history. Yet the conspiracy persists because it captures something true about the era. The paranoia, the technological hubris, the human cost of institutional ambition. Whether or not corvids were ever implanted with optical devices in Kyiv, we know that the Soviet system pursued countless programs of similar moral and practical questionability. We know that scientists were punished for projects that failed. We know that the regime viewed its citizens, and even birds, apparently, as instruments to be manipulated in service of state power. In this sense, Operation Glass Sparrow is true even if it never happened. It's true as metaphor, as encapsulation, as representative anecdote. The final question is why we want to believe it. Perhaps because the image of a bird carrying a camera is both absurd and terrifying, which describes much of 20th century totalitarianism. Perhaps because the detail of the crashed sparrow, the unintentional slapstick ending to a sinister program, provides a moment of cosmic justice in a period characterized by its absence. Perhaps because conspiracy theories about surveillance technology resonate differently in our current era of actual omnipresent monitoring. We live in a world where the fictional projects of 1938 have become real. Every smartphone is a surveillance device more sophisticated than anything the NKVD could have imagined. In this context, Operation Glass Sparrow seems less like fantasy and more like prophecy. In the archives of the Security Service of Ukraine, housed in a building not far from where the NKVD conducted its 1930s operations, there may or may not be a file about birds and cameras. If it exists, it remains classified. If it doesn't exist, its absence proves nothing. The absence of evidence, as conspiracy theorists love to point out, is not evidence of absence, and so the legend endures, neither confirmed nor refuted, neither fully credible nor entirely dismissible. The bird sees everything, but understands nothing, which might also describe our relationship to history itself. We observe, we record, we speculate, but meaning remains elusive.